Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Elizabeth, for such a warm introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be here at the second of the conferences that you've enjoyed together that I've been able to come to. And it's a real privilege to follow both Elizabeth and Mark Rutterberg, two people who really are on the global front line of the battle for data and privacy rights. I wanted to reflect on the journey we've all been on together over the last 10 or 11 months since the introduction of the new data protection regime. And I want to talk about some of the challenges that you have faced and give you my perspective on what I think the future will hold for us in data protection. The impact of the new regulation continues to be far-reaching. I strongly believe that the GDPR is a force for good. It requires organizations to be more transparent about the way they use people's information. It strengthens significantly the rights people have over their own data. And it came into force at a time of heightened awareness that people's privacy and personal data are being exploited and manipulated in ways that were hitherto unimaginable. So we in government have faced challenges in implementing the new requirements, and I recognise that data protection officers around the UK face many challenges themselves and uncertainties, and they continue to look to the ICO for guidance and support. I've received a huge number of letters from MPs and the public seeking guidance and raising concerns about specific issues. For example, last year, nearly 60 of my colleagues in Parliament wrote to me just regarding the impact of subject data access requests on GP surgeries. I've been speaking to the ICO on this matter and the problems being faced by the NHS in consequence, and I thank her for publishing guidance for those surgeries in response to those concerns. Just one example of our gratitude to the hard work of everyone at the ICO for helping organisations understand and comply with the regulation. I know that the ICO has been faced with unprecedented requests for assistance. In May 2018 alone, the ICO received over 80,000 calls, and that compared to just 16,000 in the equivalent month the year before. And if we look at a longer period, from the beginning of June 2018 until the end of February just gone, the ICO received over 306,000 inquiries via their helpline and live chat service. And this was an increase of almost 50% on the previous year. There is no doubt that some of the implementation of GDPR is complex, and some of the terminology takes some getting used to. But I return to my original point about the enormous benefits of the new regulation. Data protection, GDPR, once seen as an inconvenience, harking back to the days when privacy mattered, was possible even, it is now fast becoming the global standard. I heard last year an interview with Amazon's chief technology officer in which he dismissed privacy as something of the past. It really didn't matter anymore. Well, the climate has changed. We've heard in the previous speech about the culture in the United States. The state of California has passed privacy regulations that allow customers to opt out of data collection, requires parents to opt in on behalf of their children, and places a responsibility on companies to disclose how they use personal data. And according to a new study by Sonicon of the US market for gathering, analyzing, and selling personal data, the data extraction industry, as they call it, it is worth $76 billion in yearly revenues in the US, making it the fastest growing part of the American economy today. And according to a McKinsey study last year, data and information flows now generate more GVA than goods. We hear a lot in the UK about the 50% of our manufactured goods that depend on the EU single market. But we hear far less about the 75% of UK international data flows that trade between the UK and the rest of Europe. So there is a big awareness-raising job to be done. And as Elizabeth mentioned, today marks the launch of my department's online harms white paper. For most of us, a safer, more respectful environment online can't come too soon. Yet we are still consulting, and the necessary legislation required to implement those areas that need changes to the law are still a few years off. So it is very good that the ICO will be exercising her powers under the Data Protection Act. And the Commissioner is about to consult on a statutory age-appropriate design code for websites, apps, and platforms that attract children in significant numbers. And the essence of this will require such apps to be secure for use by children by design. And this is but one of the codes of practice that the ICO will be introducing as a precursor to the wider legislation that we foresee as a result of the Online Harms White Paper. And it's yet again an example of the UK leading the way. Very recently in the States, Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts has introduced the Kids Internet Design and Safety Act, which, if passed, would end autoplay and mandate the use of age ratings. So I think the answer, cautiously I would say, in response to Elizabeth's question, is that I believe Europe is leading the way in this environment. And there are many in the US who want to see similar controls legislated for, but I'm sure that will take time, as indeed it has taken us time. Government is working hard to ensure that departments processing personal data understand what is required of them. For example, we've published guidance on how public sector bodies should comply with Article 3(6)(4). That is the requirement to consult with the ICO on policy proposals for legislative or statutory measures relating to the processing of personal data. But protecting data does not mean that we can't share it. I sit, for instance, on the Serious Violence Task Force, which aims to reduce serious violence in our society, particularly knife crime. And one of the things I've come to realize during my work on that task force is that there are a number of myths about data sharing. And some people in our public services believe that personal data cannot, under any circumstances, be shared. But one thing we must all be clear about is that, of course, the legislation does permit information to be shared in certain legal circumstances. And despite the legislation being clear, there are still these myths abroad about what GDP may not permit. So I think a challenge for all of us is to make sure that our stakeholders understand that information can and should be shared in the appropriate circumstances. We need to be conscious of where the public interest lies. And while data protection officers play a crucial role in protecting information, the role that they can play in advising organizations about the circumstances in which data should be shared, sometimes without the consent of the data subject, is equally important. Just as internet service providers are constantly developing and introducing better products and services, criminals and hackers constantly identify ever more sophisticated ways of accessing our data. And although business has a long way to go before we can be satisfied that cyber risks are being managed effectively, there has definitely been an improvement. And the 2019 Cybersecurity Breaches Survey shows that 32% of businesses identified a cybersecurity attack in the last 12 months, which is down from 43% the previous year. And the reduction is thought to be owing to a greater awareness of the new data protection legislation and the steps that companies have taken to comply with that legislation with help and guidance from data protection practitioners and the ICO. It's imperative that our firewalls and other cybersecurity devices match these challenges. And it is vital that the ICO have the tools to investigate increasingly sophisticated data processing activities, including cyber attacks. Most of you will be aware of the high-profile data breaches, the many such that the ICO are currently investigating. And as Elizabeth mentioned, we took the opportunity during the passage of the legislation last year to strengthen the ICO's enforcement tools, including powers to carry out unannounced inspections and urgent assessments of organizations' processing activities, reinforced by the power under GDPR to impose far higher fines of up to £17 million or 4% of global turnover. This and the powers should equip the ICO for the challenges that lie ahead. We have a regulator that is prepared to work with organizations to test new processing activities and advise on compliance to ensure that data breaches do not occur in the first place. And when that doesn't work, we have a regulator that is not afraid to tackle the biggest companies in the world and political organizations who flout the law, seek ways to get around it, and bring robust enforcement action where appropriate. Before I end, I would just like to say a few words about Brexit and the challenges that we face here. We want to make sure data flows between the UK and the EU remain uninterrupted after we leave the EU. And we need the space to negotiate a future relationship with the EU, including what we do to protect those data flows and the role that the ICO would play in regulatory cooperation mechanisms. The political declaration sets out our clear pathway for our continued close cooperation on data protection after our EU exit, based on adequacy decisions. The Commission will begin their assessment of the UK as soon as possible after our withdrawal, and the UK stands absolutely ready to begin these assessments. But in the disastrous event that the UK leaves the EU without a deal, we will still need those adequacy decisions to underpin the free flow of personal data between the EU and the UK. So it would be in the best interests of both sides to start preparatory discussions on an adequacy assessment as soon as possible to speed the process and minimise any disruption. The UK and the government and the ICO have already begun advising organisations in the UK on how to prepare for a no-deal scenario, notably by implementing alternative legal transfer mechanisms known as standard contractual clauses. Regarding data flows from the UK to the EU, the UK government does not intend to impose additional requirements on transfers of data from the UK to the EU at the point of exit. And this means, for example, that personal data should be transferred from the UK to the EU as now. And this decision will be kept under review. But as I said earlier, 75% of our international data flows are with countries within the EU. Our government can and will refrain from placing barriers on EU countries sending data to the UK if Britain leaves without a deal. But the protections to data flows afforded by the withdrawal agreement will not pertain if we do leave without a deal. We will become, overnight, a third country without an adequacy agreement and little prospect of gaining one in the very near future. So I'm pleased to be able to say for the most of the forthcoming Brexit discussion, so I won't say any more to be able to stay for your forthcoming Brexit discussion. So I won't say any more on that now, but I was very pleased to hear from the ICO that our organisation, our regulator, is having such an impact on the global debate about data protection, because the ICO have certainly had a huge impact on the European environment in this area. So it just remains for me to now thank Elizabeth, Robert, and the 100 people from the ICO and all your team for putting on this excellent conference, which for me has provided such fascinating insights already with the first 2 keynote speeches. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you again. And if there is time for 1 or 2 questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Thank you. Or we can move straight on to this if you prefer.
Well, we've got time for a couple of questions. And in time-honoured fashion, we have roving mics here. So you need to put your arms up and give a clear signal, and somebody will run with a mic straight away. There's a guy over there with a white shirt I can see straight away. Can I ask that you please say who you are, and please ask a succinct question. Thank you.
Hi, Tony Shepherd from GDPR and Schools. You mentioned about consultation, where there's changes to how data is processing. The DFE has just released their EdTech strategy. Is there consultation between DCMS, ICO and DFE around the implications of using technology with children?
I will check into that. There should be, because of the consultation requirement that we have outlined. And as you rightly say, EdTech will, by definition, involve children and probably children's data. It's a huge growth industry. Much of it will benefit teaching and learning. But you're quite right to suggest that there should be a consultation between the DFE, my department, and the ICO, and I will make sure that that has occurred.
Okay, thank you. Time for 1 more question. Quick hand. We've got somebody over this side here. There's a gentleman there. Oh, so there we are. Number 2. Thank you. Go.
Thank you. Mark Goddard, Computer Centre. Given the vote to leave is some years ago, what are the impediments that have occurred to prevent an adequacy assessment being put in place by now?
The impediment really is a legal one from the EU's perspective. The EU can, by its own laws, only undertake an adequacy decision of a country outside the European Union. So whilst we are a member state negotiating our withdrawal from the European Union, the EU are unable to commence adequacy decisions with us until we have left. Now, if we leave with a deal, we have arranged through the political declaration that there'll be a transition period of up to 2 years. And during that time, the EU have given every indication that they will commence adequacy discussions with us as soon as possible after we have left. And we are hopeful, we can't guarantee it, but we are hopeful that by the end of the transition period, we will have an adequacy decision so that we will be able to move seamlessly from membership to being a third country with an adequacy decision. But obviously, if we leave without a deal, then all that pre-planning does not apply. We become a third country overnight, and therefore we'll have to wait our time for an adequacy decision.